Now, when each one of them spoke to me privately, then you'd hear the questions I raised, and also the fact that, well, for example, if they left Mubarak and moved on, why shouldn't they leave us? It's all a calculation. So I'm surprised, really, or can you shed some light on why is the Gulf going to be important to America, how much so, and how can you convince Arab Gulf states on this? The second question to Bill Quandt. Bill, you mentioned, I think, a very fundamental point, that the real challenge is how to explain to America that the peace process is important to America, not because you're doing Israel or the Arabs a favor. And I think the last American president who put this issue to the table was Bush the father with Secretary Baker. Since then, I lived through part of this. It was all about how much the Israelis could take, or how much the Arabs could take, or how much they couldn't take. And that's not a very convincing argument, frankly, in the Middle East or in America. Why should Americans think differently now? And for that matter, for this audience, if we were to speak to Americans, what should we emphasize in terms of why this is important to America? And to my long-standing friend, Dan Kurtzer, first of all, I need to commend you not only on your article in the Cairo Review, which is for sale outside, but also on the two books that you've worked on recently with Bill Quandt. They're really interesting pieces. But you seem to emphasize the importance, or at least my conclusions were that you actually wanted Obama to adopt Obama parameters, something in the spirit of the Clinton parameters, hopefully before that last month, and he leaves office. And that you wanted to emphasize, and I completely agree with you here, that it has to be about closure now. It can't be about small steps, and we're far beyond that. Way back, we had discussions about the shape of tables and who could sit beside who, but I think we've gone beyond that. Do you really believe that President Obama could take this on, and if so, why? Is it a legacy issue, or would it be his conviction that it really is important for America? I'll stop with those questions and give you a chance to answer them, then we'll take some of the questions that I have here compiling from the floor. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I knew you would ask difficult questions. The American administration, and certainly this administration, I think, is in the process of developing responses and policies related to the Middle East in transition. The Arab Spring has created a new situation. And certainly it is time for us to come up with a better understanding of what's happening in the region, and that's something that I think we're working on, but also new approaches. Some time ago, when I was working in the Gulf, our focus was entirely strategic, as Dean Fahmy indicates. We talked about this landmass of the Arabian Peninsula. We talked about bases. We talked about access to ports and providing the Gulf Cooperation Council with weapons to defend themselves against threats. And originally it was the Soviet Union and then Iran. And it was entirely a strategic discussion. And then belatedly, and this was in the late 1990s, we got instructions to talk about trade promotion. Trade promotion is very important to the U.S. national interest. There are major buyers of American goods and services in the Arabian Peninsula. The UAE, I understand, is the major source of American purchases and American trade. And so our trade representatives got a new level of encouragement from Washington. But it wasn't until George W. Bush came along that we officially talked about democracy promotion and related it to our U.S. national interests. Now, he didn't do it in the right way, in my opinion, but it is now part of the discussion in Washington that has been added to territory, strategic, and trade issues. But we still haven't gotten to a very sophisticated level of understanding of what our policies ought to be in countries like those on the Arabian Peninsula. But I'm encouraged a little bit because I think President Obama has a much more nuanced understanding of the world than his predecessor. It's not one size fits all. It's take your time, study the issues, regard each country and each issue as a separate one, and try to work with people in the region and with allies in order to solve the issues. So I can't give you a complete encouragement that we've changed, but I think we're moving in the right direction with President Obama's attitude toward a more nuanced and comprehensive view of what our interests are in the region.
Thank you.
I'll just very briefly try to answer your question about why should the United States care about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. First, I'm struck by the fact that people whose business it is to think about strategy and hard-headed national interests and not about domestic politics and sentimental things, the two most recent commanders of CENTCOM, the area of military responsibilities that include the Middle East, have both said in public testimony before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict would make their job much easier. Now, maybe they're smoking some illegal substance and are fantasizing and are wrong about this, but these are pretty hard-headed military guys who deal with people in the region and think that at least to some extent their job of getting the cooperation of countries in the region, getting governments to cooperate with the United States might be easier. Why could that possibly be? Well, in case anybody hasn't noticed, the United States has become very unpopular in the Middle East. All the public opinion polls show that even where we have good relations with governments, public opinion is very hostile. Why? Well, Iraq didn't help, but time after time after time, when ordinary citizens in this part of the world are asked, what is it about American policy that you most dislike? It's our one-sided support for Israel and our perceived hostility toward Palestinian rights. So we could make at least some inroads to those perceptions and perhaps begin to rebuild a relationship with peoples and governments in this part of the region that wouldn't be so colored by this perception of bias and unfairness and one-sidedness. The second reason, I think, is that when this problem is ignored for any prolonged period, it has a way of blowing up. We'll have another crisis in Gaza, and the last time we came through it without too much collateral damage, but your government was nervous about it, we were nervous about it. Had things gone on at greater length, had it become nastier, I can easily imagine that pressures in your country would have grown for taking some action against Israel, at which point our Congress would have said, why should we be giving, $1.4 billion a year to a country that's just suspended its diplomatic relations with Israel? We could see things that are already difficult get much worse very quickly. And so my answer is we will get some national interest benefit. It's not a panacea to all of our problems in the Middle East. It won't solve our problems with Iran, but it takes an issue away from Iran in their rather demagogic manipulation of the Palestinian issue, on which they play a very kind of cynical role, more pro-Palestinian than the Palestinians seem to be, in a kind of, absolute maximalist terms. So I do think that reputation is part of what a great power needs to cultivate. And our reputation right now, after Iraq, after Afghanistan, after failed Arab-Israeli diplomacy, needs a success. Is this the arena for a big success? I would say it's easier to imagine a successful Israeli-Palestinian negotiation than fixing Syria, just to take another desirable but very difficult challenge. So it's not the only thing we should worry about in the Middle East. I think we have to be able to do more than one thing competently at a time, but I do still think it's an important issue, and I think the president, if he wanted to, could make the case that this is one of the important issues that should command significant resources of the United States. Now, the resources tend, incidentally, not to be financial resources. This doesn't cost us a huge amount of money compared to the Iraq War, which has cost us well over $1 trillion. This is chicken feed. It takes time and energy and political argumentation and frequent flyer miles of secretaries of state. You have to spend a lot of time on it. That's fine. What else should we be doing as a big power? You know, make your diplomats work and make them work hard. That's what they're paid for.
On the two kind of preliminary issues that you raised, Nabil, yes, I would advocate that the United States adopt for itself parameters and then decide what to do with them. Now, if we get to negotiations or plan for negotiations, those parameters would be available to be used as terms of reference. If we expect the Israelis and Palestinians to negotiate terms of reference before they get to negotiations, we'll spend all of our time on the terms of reference. So I don't think we need to make a decision in advance of negotiations on what we're going to do with the parameters. But yes, I think it's time that the United States had a vision for itself and then can use through its diplomacy with the parties in the region on where we think this conflict should be heading in terms of resolution. And on the second question, yes, for sure, that we have to focus on closure. And I don't want anything that I've said to suggest that it's going to be easy to get to closure. It's like the half-life of a tree. The closer you get, I don't know, further away it seems to get. We are not that far apart with respect to all of the core issues, but the distances are still fairly great, and therefore it will require a substantial amount of effort. And that leads to the question that Bill just started to answer, and I would only add one point, and that is, so if so, why or can Obama focus on this? And the answer is that we have a president who, for better or worse, still believes that there are not problems that he can't solve. Or, putting it in the positive, still believes that he can have a transformative impact on a wide range of issues. We know from even the time that he was running for president in 2008 that the Middle East peace process was one of those issues on his mind. We know that he was ready to speak some truth to power with respect to domestic politics in the United States on this issue. Some of the early confrontations that he had with Prime Minister Netanyahu suggest, even if the tactics may have been misguided, suggest the president was ready to expend some capital. And he's now learned, over a course of 4 years, hopefully learned what does and does not work. So in terms of attracting the president's interest, I think we are already there. And for the reasons that Bill suggested, both the positive impact that this has on whatever else we do in the region, the negative implications of doing nothing and having to deal with the after effects of a crisis, and the larger policy outcome of perhaps even succeeding in an American-led or a process in which the Americans have contributed, make this potentially quite attractive to a president who still believes that he can.
Thank you all for these comments. I will get into the questions from the floor, but I just wanted to add an additional reason why I think America should look at this issue carefully. One is that in a Middle East, which we're living in today, which is clearly, or people are clearly trying to assert their authority with their own officials, standing up against what they feel is discrimination or inequalities and so on and so forth. If this process succeeds, and we end up with a constructive result, you will have a much stronger Arab world insisting and being angrier at you if you have double standards, or if you don't work the issues properly, or if they feel frustrated with a country that appears to be your friend. So there is an American interest in that. If, of course, we fail and we get into an even angrier mood, resorting to force rather than to peaceful negotiations, then there's an additional reason to try to deal with this now. Having, as I think President Anderson mentioned, having worked in the States, one of the things that always amused me is that you have a panel talking about something and the questions come about something completely different. So let me start with those, because they're interesting questions, but the ones that you were addressing. Why does America support the Brotherhood? Why don't you think that Egypt is important? Are you standing on principle, or in terms of your national interest, because of your support for the Brotherhood? Are you supporting the Brotherhood because of Israel and its ability to, so to speak, control the Arab-Israeli fronts more efficiently than secular systems? Let me just sort of start off with those, and I'll get back into what you talked about.
Dan, you were ambassador here.
I can see the water running downhill here. I served in Egypt twice, from 1979 to 82 as a relatively junior officer, at which time we actually had a dialogue with the Muslim Brotherhood. Political counselor at the American Embassy would meet with I don't know if he was the supreme guide, but he was a very senior person within the organization. I often took notes. Came back as ambassador 17 years later, and we did not have a dialogue with the Brotherhood for many reasons, not the least of which was that Egypt had experienced a period of some turmoil in the early 1990s, violence and great uncertainty in security terms in the country, and the United States felt that it would be inappropriate. So we have had a fairly open mind with respect to the Brotherhood. And in the immediate aftermath of the revolution, the January 25 revolution, with the Brotherhood, in a sense, coming out and becoming a part of the system and the politics in the system, it would have been inappropriate for the United States not to talk to the Brotherhood. Now, having said that, the suggestion that somehow the Brotherhood is our party, is our preferred party, it's not really right. I'm trying to be diplomatic. And the further suggestion that we're talking to the Brotherhood because we're doing Israel a favor really reveals a certain amount of undescribable lack of knowledge about the region. So I don't think those are serious questions. The United States, I think, wisely is conducting its dialogue with throughout the political system, with the government, which happens to be now led by a president from the Freedom and Justice Party. When a parliament is elected, we will talk to all factions in that parliament. And until a parliament's elected, we will talk to all factions, including the opposition. And that's the nature of what we do as diplomats. It's the nature of what your ambassador in Washington did with parties in power or out of power, parties that were popular and parties not popular. So nothing is exactly equal, but I think it's a wrong perception to suggest that we have a favorite or a favored party. And I think it's wise that, in fact, we are talking to everyone within this system to try to understand what's happening in Egypt better so as to make our policy wiser.
There's obviously no enthusiasm for the other to answer these questions, so I'll move on to there's a set of questions about the peace process, and again, I will go through them all, and any one of you can address them. First, I think, again, if not Bill mentioned this a little bit, how do you see the composition of the new Israeli coalition affecting Israel's readiness to move forward on peace process issues. Secondly, and this is, while it's a strongly crafted question, I think it does actually touch on an important point. Is America actually part of the problem in not being able to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict? And let me elaborate on this, because it's not my question. In following American policies in the past, and this goes back to Bush 41 and vis-a-vis the others, up until then you seemed to support Israel. After then, you seemed to support the Israeli right, which made it much more difficult to push them towards the peace process. So, and in that sense, and I think, Dan, in your article and part of the co-authored book, you mentioned this, that America should not be the only player on conflict resolution in the Middle East. So if you could sort of elaborate on how useful, I think it's an indispensable role, but I'm not sure whether it's part of the problem or not as well at the same time. Secondly, or thirdly, domestically in Israel, with the direction of the constituency there, is it really possible to have a viable Palestinian state as part of a partition? Or are we looking at, again, Bantustans and Swiss cheese formulations? There are a couple of comments that are very tough vis-a-vis what President Obama has been saying, or the need for him to continue to be very outspoken in supporting Israel, even at a time when there's no real threat against Israel. And this goes to a point that I think Bill Quandt raised about desirability, about what drives America to move on these issues. The question here is, does America really have the will to engage Israelis seriously about the compromises that are required to have a two-state solution, which I think two, if not all three of you believe is the right way to move forward. And the last question seems to come from somebody who was listening very, very carefully, as well as may have even read part of your article. When you both mentioned the importance of accepting the different narratives, or at least understanding and not ignoring the different narratives between Israelis and Palestinians. The question here is, well, aren't these narratives really in conflict with each other? Can you accept them and then still feel you can get a solution? Let me start with those peace process questions, and then, Bill, I'll get back to you on some of the other issues. Why don't I let Dan and Bill address those questions?
Can I start by picking up a piece of your earlier question? Somebody asked the question, why doesn't Egypt count for anything anymore? You know, I know you're in a fairly gloomy mood about what's happening in your country, many of you, but I don't think it's fair to say the United States has totally turned its back on Egypt. I mean, we are in a kind of retrenchment of our own in terms of big, ambitious, expensive foreign policy adventures, and you probably ought to be thankful for part of that. I mean, we tend to be pretty heavy-footed when we decide to move around aggressively in the Middle East, but we haven't cut our economic and political and military aid to Egypt. Hillary Clinton came here regularly, or at least a couple of times. Kerry, on his first trip, came to Egypt. The president's going to be coming and has been in touch. So I think it's a mistake to say we've given up on our relationship. But you have other priorities than your relationship with the United States right now. We have other priorities, and it's not going to go back to the way it was under President Mubarak. So we're in the process of kind of negotiating a new, and I think in some ways probably a more realistic kind of relationship, where our expectations of what today's Egypt can and will do in the region have to be adjusted a bit differently. It's not going to be the same as it was in the past, But I think if you were to ask Americans, what are the 2 or 3 most important countries in terms of American foreign policy in the Middle East, Egypt would still be in that group. So don't get too despondent. But yeah, things are changing, but not to the point where Americans no longer care about Egypt. It's just our tourists are a little bit afraid to come, and that may be cause for concern. Now, does the United States have the will to engage Israel on the crucial issues? I don't know. I mean, that's what we're trying to think out loud with you about. We have a re-elected president. He's got a new team of people. There are serious arguments about why we should pay attention to this, but there's also a counter argument that there are other crucial issues in Asia that demand attention. There's the whole Iranian crisis that is just waiting to kind of blow up. And so it's a debate that is going to have to be played out over the next, I think, probably months. My sense is that President Obama's making the trip that he's making to the Middle East now, partly to make a judgment of his own, is there any point in tackling this issue one more time, or is it simply a hopeless case? I mean, we've talked about how difficult the new Israeli coalition makes it seem to be at all optimistic about there being a partner for peace. But he's going to have that conversation with Netanyahu and whoever else he needs to talk to in Israel to make up his own mind. And he may come back from the trip saying, good luck, Secretary of State, you push the issue forward, but I've got other things to do. Let me know if there's an opening. I hope it doesn't come to that, because that probably, that sentiment very quickly gets conveyed, and if people in the region think the president's not interested or committed, you can be pretty sure that they're not going to budge. So we will know fairly soon the answer to that question. I can't tell you. I think Obama, on some intellectual level, understands the issues quite well, but he is a politician who has to make judgments about where to use his not huge stock of political capital. And this may or may not turn out to be one of those issues.
I want to deal with the interesting question before getting to the hard question. First, the issue of narratives. And I call it the interesting question because Bill probably did it in his classes. I certainly do it in mine at Princeton. I start with narratives when I'm teaching the Arab-Israeli conflict. And what's interesting, as you go down the list of the issues that each side defines as part of its narrative, is that at the end of the day, you put the 2 lists up on the board and they are exactly the same in terms of historical injustice, in terms of diaspora politics, in terms of the need to deal with the injustice of the world. You name an issue and you will have as part of each side's narrative the same thing. So the person who asked the question is exactly right. If you only look at narratives, you can come up with the conclusion that this is a zero-sum game, that one side has to win, because if the other side wins anything, it impacts on the narrative of the first side. I think, though, in terms of conflict resolution, because of the complementarity or coincidence of these 2 narratives, the 2 sides, in some ways, understand each other better than almost any conflicted parties anywhere else in the world. And that may sound strange, hearing it in Cairo, but having served not just here twice, I also served in Israel twice and lived up close to Israelis and Palestinians. These are 2 peoples who, maybe as a result of their common narratives across a divide, are also bound at the hip. And I could tell you story after story of the times that we got fed up with either one or both of them, and they would find a way back to each other, even in times of greatest violence, even during the Intifada when I was serving there as the United States ambassador. So I think narratives are a fascinating question. I think they have to be thought about in terms of the policy process, but I don't think at the end of the day, in this conflict situation, they act as a barrier to possible resolution of conflict. There will have to be interesting ways to resolve, For example, the question of justice that both demand to be part of the outcome, but these outcomes are not beyond the ability of people of goodwill to resolve. The more challenging question is the one, is America part of the problem? And the subsidiary question, we're not just supporting Israel, it's perceived, but we're supporting the right wing in Israel. If I could digress for one moment, Bill and I actually started collaborating in 2007 in what ended up not just in 2 books, but in 3 books. And we wanted to take a hard look at the American role in the peace process. And it became such a hard look that when the 3rd book was published, we actually have a line in, I think it's the preface or the introduction, which reminds readers that this is not our conflict. This is actually a conflict between the parties themselves. Because if you only read the book, there are very strong indictments in the book of US policy. We did this wrong, we failed to do this, we didn't build on this possibility, we didn't exploit this opportunity. But at the end of the day, this is not our conflict. And so as much as we have much to learn from what we did and failed to do, the reality is that, and I'll put it in terms of the question, we are not part of that problem. Now, where we are a part of the problem is the fact that we can do better. And we can do better in the ways that Bill suggested in his comments, or we've written in our various writings. We can do better in terms of calibrating the degree to which we are supportive of both sides. The United States, for lots of reasons, is going to tilt toward Israel on matters of security. But the United States should tilt towards the Palestinians on matters of governance and territory. And that kind of a balance doesn't make it equal, but ends up fulfilling what we think are the core requirements of the 2 sides. Palestinians need the dignity of their own state in a viable territorial entity, and Israelis, as you know better than anybody here in Cairo, are consumed by their security, and therefore need to be assured that an outcome of a 2-state solution will be at least as secure as what they think they have now. And that's the way that we have thought that the United States might calibrate its relationships. Have we done a good job in doing so until now? No. And that's why we've written some books and some articles to suggest ways to improve it. I'd add one additional point, because there are people here who not only have worked on this issue, but actually are still working on it. It's a challenge that I laid down in a speech I gave in Israel some time ago. I think the Israelis and the Egyptians and the Palestinians have to go through the same mental exercise that we've gone through to look at ourselves, for you to look at yourselves. Has Egyptian policy done all that it can do to not only support one side in this conflict, but to actually come up with a conflict resolution mechanism? Have Israelis done all that they can do? And I think only through that self-examination are we honest enough to say at the end, no, we haven't done enough, but here's ways in which we might learn those lessons and do better in the future.
Thank you, Dan. If I hadn't listened to the first part of your answer, I would have concluded from the second part that you were using a typical diplomatic technique of asking a question to answer the question, but frankly, to your credit, you always ask the question first before pushing the ball back towards the other side. I'm going to read through a number of the questions, and I'll then ask all 3 of the panelists to respond to them as they wish, but also taking questions from the floor, because I want to give them a chance to respond to these questions, and also Dr. Kurtzer a chance to close the meeting with a substantive comment. And I know we promised you 8 o'clock, and we have the board here, so I have to be on time and rigorous. Question to Master Rugh. Define for us what actually are America's interests, strategic interests in the Gulf, and what will they be? Secondly, could you talk a little bit about U.S.-Iranian relations? What's happening now? Is there potential movement forward? And can you actually deal with the Iranian nuclear issue while ignoring the Israeli nuclear issue? third question, again to Ambassador Rugh, is, well, is there really a dichotomy between principles and strategic interest? I mean, can you draw a clear line here? And in the case of Bahrain and Yemen, are they mutually exclusive? And then, this question I just asked. Yeah, there's a critique, if I may, it's not mine again, that all of you, particularly Bill and Bill Quandt, seem to be talking about Obama's interest in multilateralism, but he's also, where he hadn't announced during the election, he's also used force in areas quite easily. So is he moving away from the use of force to negotiations? And the example given here was the drone example, in particular in Pakistan and in Yemen. Do the three of you think that America should or has to continue to play the policeman of the world? And then there are a lot of questions here about double standards. I won't repeat them. You've heard them from many Arabs for a long period of time. I'm not belittling the questions, but you don't have time to address them. And then there's a question, frankly, which I'm going to try to address tomorrow in an article. What actually is Obama going to do on his visit to the Middle East this week? In Israel, in Jordan, why the choice of countries? And how does this play in the sort of the strategic vision of America for the Middle East? Dr. Shaib, you wanted to have a short comment to add to the question?
Question from the floor.
Well, if it's a short question, please do it now so that they take it into account and answer it with these questions. And then I'll give the floor to Beckett after that.
Yes, back to the issue of Egypt. Mr. Kurtzer said that it's inappropriate not to talk to your Muslim brothers while they are, of course, in government. But the belief here in Egypt that it wasn't a matter of talking to them, it's the support of the United States that brought the Muslim brother to power. And it was like a deal between the two right from the beginning of the revolution. This is the belief, and people are very disappointed here that the U.S. is supporting the Muslim brother in spite of the fact that they are not advocating democracy, they are not, they don't care about human rights or women's rights. All this unrest and the opposition that's happening now, and the U.S. is still closing an eye. And the belief again, if the U.S. stops supporting the Muslim Brothers, then this government will not continue. Thank you.
Okay, why don't I give the panelists a chance to respond to the questions that they choose, and then I'll hand over the floor to my co-convener, Dr. Korni.
Thank you. Dean Fahmy has asked a series, or you all have asked a series of different questions. Let me briefly respond to them. What are our strategic interests in the Gulf? Classically, if you're the American ambassador to a country in the Gulf, you talk about in your policy paper to Washington and in your you keep in mind in your discussions with host governments questions of access, military access, questions of overflight, questions of bases or quasi-bases. We originally, decades ago, had a naval base in Bahrain. We still do, but we don't call it that. We have placed pre-positioned military equipment in Oman. We have a similar arrangement in Kuwait. Traditionally, and for the strict definition of strategic interests, we look at access in those terms. Question of Iran is a very complicated one. And we don't have time to go into it. Yes, it is anomalous that, or at least seems anomalous, that we don't equate Iranian development of nuclear weapons that they seem to want to develop, or we're concerned that they will develop, with, we don't compare them with the Israeli development, Pakistani development, Indian development, and it comes down to lack of trust, a concern about Iranian intentions. And if you look strictly at what they're actually doing, the Israelis and the Pakistanis and the Indians are way ahead of Iran. Iran says it's not developing a nuclear weapon. We don't trust that, or at least Washington doesn't trust that. And I won't go further into the question of Iran because it's an extremely complicated one, and if we really want to discuss it, we should have Professor Kazemi up here, who is sitting in the front row, and he's the real expert. Do we distinguish between principles and strategic interests? Yes, strategic interests can be narrowly defined, as I just tried to define them in the traditional sense of it. Principles involve our concern for human rights, our concern for the rule of law, our concern for justice, our concern for democracy and democracy promotion. Those are basic principles that I'm sure our president believes in, and when he chooses one over the other, it's a question of looking at what is the American priority, and you often have to choose between two goals. If you look at his choice in Libya, he did lean in the direction of defending the Libyan opposition against apparent annihilation in Benghazi. In the situation in Syria, he is supporting the provision of humanitarian assistance to the Syrian opposition, but not military weapons. There are at least two reasons for that. He's under a lot of pressure to supply weapons to the opposition. One of the reasons that he's resisted that pressure from our friends in the Gulf, from our friends in Syria, from our friends in the UK and France, and from the American political right and left. The first reason that is the most talked about is that we're afraid the arms will fall, the weapons will fall into terrorists. The Jabhat al-Nusra is usually cited as a logical threat there. It's a radical group of fighters who are in Syria. We don't want them to get their hands on our weapons. But a more important reason, I'm told by people in Washington, is a concern not to get involved in the proxy war with Russia. We have other fish to fry with Russia. We have a concern to get the Russians on board with us in dealing with the Iranian threat. And the last thing we want is to come into open conflict with Russia in Syria. Do we want to be a policeman of the world? American officials all believe, and American politicians and American presidents all believe in American exceptionalism. And you can't get elected unless you say you believe in American exceptionalism. But that doesn't lead to Obama believing that the U.S. should be the policeman of the world. Perhaps his predecessor went that far, but Obama, as I tried to indicate earlier, it has a much more nuanced view of America's role in the world. It is more engagement, it is more diplomatic engagement, it is more multilateral, and is much more nuanced. Thank you.
All due respect, Nabil, I do not think the United States brought the Muslim Brotherhood to power, nor was it terribly enthusiastic about its rise. Having said that, what do you do as a country that has welcomed the advent of relatively free and fair elections in a country which chooses first a parliament, which has a significant Islamist, if you take Salafis and Muslim Brotherhood together, majority. And then you have a presidential campaign in which, had the non-Islamist candidates gotten their act together and run a single candidate in the first round, you wouldn't have a Muslim Brethren president today. You just add up the numbers and you can see that 3 or 4 of those people combined in a single candidacy would have won. But those were choices made in Egypt. We would have been perfectly happy with a different presidential outcome. But we didn't call the shots. I know it's hard to believe that, powerful America doesn't micromanage everything in the world, but as I look at American policy today, I'm struck with how few things that we prefer actually end up happening. It's really striking. We didn't want the Iraq that exists today, and we tried mightily to create a different Iraq. After $1 trillion and 5,000 dead Americans and hundreds of thousands of dead Iraqis, believe me, today's Iraq is not what we set out to get. Today's Iran is not anything that we want. Although the Shah believed that we brought Khomeini to power as an act of perverse, anti-Soviet communism, because a fanatic Islamist would at least not be a communist. I think it's not true. We get a lot of outcomes in the world that are different from our preferences. Elect another president, elect another parliament, we'll probably conclude that we have to deal with it as well. But I think the burden now is on Egyptians to figure out their domestic politics and not to count on us to sort them out for you, because we don't know how to do it. And when we try to do it, it often backfires. We say, that's the guy we want to support, and sure enough, their stock goes down because we are kind of toxic in this part of the world. I agree with Bill Rugh about the image of the United States as aspiring to be the policeman of the world is an old-fashioned idea. There were brief moments of enthusiasm for such concepts, and you'll still get little flickers of it from people who are wedded to a kind of an American imperial role. But I'm struck much more how Americans today are disengaging from this notion that we need to try to shape world affairs in every single part of the world. Nobody in the United States is saying we have to go fix the problems of the Congo, which is one of the worst human rights places in the world, or that we have to fix Pakistan. We'd like a different regime to deal with in Pakistan, or a different set of policies, but it's too big and too complicated and too dangerous for us. We can't even fix Afghanistan with all the money that, nor did the Soviets incidentally, nor will anybody else. But I think we've learned that you need to be a little bit more modest in your expectations about what power, raw power, can do. If there is a new preoccupation in the world, and we may overdo this, it is a sense that the Middle East is no longer the center of the universe. If there is a center geostrategically that needs more attention, it's Asia, and that's because of China. We cannot afford to mismanage China's rise. It's going to be the other big power in the coming decades. And so far we have an okay relationship with it, but historically a rising power is going to be assertive and it's going to test limits. And I think if there is a part of the world that many of us worry about, even though my heart is still with the Middle East, I would say President Obama and his successors will have to spend more time thinking about Asia and the management of the relationship with China. And that's what people refer to as the pivot toward Asia. Now, it's a bad image because it implies that you can't do more than one thing at a time. It's either all Middle East all the time or all Asia all the time. And that's not quite the way the world works. But I do think it is the case that whether we like it or not, we are going to be drawn into Asian affairs because they own our economy to a very large extent. Every time we spend $1 on the American economy, it's with dollars that we borrow essentially from the Chinese because they own a lot of our dollars. And they simply are, unless something dramatically changes, they're going to be a very significant power in that part of the world where we have alliance commitments, where there's a crazy leader in North Korea who has nuclear weapons and talks like a madman, doesn't act on most of it. But Asia is going to be a major preoccupation. If I were a Middle Easterner, I'd say that's what is probably going to be visible, is this kind of shift of focus from an America that has been overinvested in the Middle East and hasn't done very well with all of its expenditures, and where there is a kind of fatigue of, Iraq didn't go well, Arab-Israeli issues don't go well, Lebanon's a mess, Syria's even worse. And at least with Asia, you're dealing with fairly predictable regimes, difficult conflicts, but we have relations with all of the states except for North Korea, and stability is achievable there. So that's what I would be thinking about in terms of big picture, not antiquated views of the Americans are going to come in and solve everybody's problem or bring people to power or micromanage your politics. I think that's an old-fashioned image which is really, really quite out of date.
I would first add just one element to Phil's, I think, very comprehensive answer on the question of the United States and the Muslim Brotherhood. At some point, the formulation of U.S. policy after January 25, 2011, until the departure of Mubarak, is going to make for a really good, at least one, but probably many doctoral dissertations, because it'll be a very comprehensive case study in kind of raw American policymaking. Like in Egypt or any other country, American policy doesn't come forth with some Wizard of Oz gimmickry, somebody sitting behind a big screen and pushing all the buttons. There are policy debates, there are interests at stake, there are very challenging, emotional, historical, institutional ties that are at play. And none, at least in my memory, has been as dramatic as the fluctuations in U.S. thinking that those of us on the outside were able to see during that short period of 2.5, almost 3 weeks. So I mention that as an addendum to what Bill was saying, because it cuts at this argument, which I think is a totally wrong argument, that somehow this was part of an American plan, or that we cut a deal, or that we had some alternative idea in mind. There's as much a reactive element in American policy here as proactive, and I think that needs to be kept in mind. Nabil also asked the question of what will Obama actually do this week as opposed to big policy, and just since we're here, we can speculate. There are certainly 3 reasons why he's making the trip and why he's chosen Israel as the centerpiece of the trip. I think he's spending 3 days there, if I'm not mistaken. Number 1, I would say, is station identification. There was a lot of ferment within the pro-Israel community in the United States over the past 4 years over the fact that he didn't visit Israel, but had visited Cairo, did visit Riyadh, gave a major speech in Cairo and in Turkey, and seemed to be, quote-unquote, boycotting our friends in Israel. So part of this is simply to convey the idea that there's not a boycott, that he can and does want to visit and have those conversations. Secondly, there's an opportunity here for the president to actually touch the Israeli people and for them to touch him. I don't mean physically, but to get to know better people beyond Netanyahu's circle, and to be able to impact them through his activities, his speeches, his press commentary, and just the pressing the flesh as he's moving from one place to the other. And there's no question that in large policy terms, this is going to be very important, because when you're not able to talk directly to the people of a country of interest, what you say ends up getting filtered by somebody else. It gets filtered by the government, it gets filtered by your own spokesman, it gets filtered by the media. the president's now going to he's out there, and he's going to say what he says and do what he does, and people will like it or not like it, but it's not going to be, as I use the word again, filtered. And then the third reason, of course, for his going is to talk business. There is a long-standing U.S.-Israeli strategic dialogue on Iran. Some of it is to compare intelligence and strategic assessments. Some of it has also been to try to rein in some of the more proactive tendencies that sometimes the Israelis manifest. You remember last summer there was war talk on the part of the Netanyahu government, and the United States worked very hard behind the scenes to tamp that down and put things back into perspective. And I think in addition to the kind of substance of the U.S.-Israeli dialogue on Iran, part of it's also going to be to make sure that we are working on kind of the same wavelength on an issue that is of great importance to both of us. Finally, what we hope is on his agenda is this Middle East peace process. And that even though the White House seems to have gone out of its way to reduce expectations or lower expectations, that in fact they've lowered the expectations publicly in order to have a frank conversation privately. But that's a speculative comment.
Thank you, Dan. Dr. Corey?
Actually, when we, as President Quandt said, this has been a tradition in Canada. We try to exploit the presence of some members of the Board of Trustees to have a discussion, to see how America thinks. And these are people who know the Middle East. Have been doing that for 6-7 years. Bill Quandt, I think, is the dean of that because he has been always there. Farhan Kazemi used to be there, but he defected. Then we have two recruits, Rugh and Kurtzer. This time, this is the first time we do it in collaboration with them. And I think this is one of the best we have done. And we have set a trap for our analysts. The idea after the Arab Spring. How is Washington going to cope? It's not an easy question. Because after the Arab Spring, what is the situation like? We know where we came from, but we don't know where the Middle East is going. So it was a trap. I think we wanted to know Washington's narrative, as Nabil said. Is there a new balance between means and ends? For that, I tried to make a survey with some of my students, junior colleagues, some people even in the street, trying to see if we are on the same page, as they say in America. Do we have the same priorities? And interestingly enough, the questions that came reflected much more the survey than many of the priorities of the panels. Very interesting. 3 issues were emphasized in that unscientific survey. One, almost in that order, Israel. And the idea is that Israel is off the hook, almost in control. People are not blaming Washington for that. They are also saying, actually, the Arab Spring has other priorities. Serious, quite serious. Number 2, oil. And here perhaps slight difference with William Rugh. people actually think that the US is going to be independent. As somebody said to me, it might be the new Saudi Arabia. Colorado might be the new Zamalek, somebody said to me. Interesting. Would that have an impact on American policy in the Middle East? At least competing with the Gulf countries. And number three, and this is really and the third issue actually, and that is the most problematic one, is that people think that whatever is done and said in the Middle East, the US aims at stability. That is their objective. Which is, I suppose, quite legitimate. But interesting point that came out in this respect, that what is new with the US this time is that it is making a distinction between Islamists. There are bad Islamists, Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, and good Islamists. Muslim Brotherhood, Zamalek. But people are not clear about the criteria of the distinction. Some say we see it is campaign. That comes very frequently. Human rights, they are not sure. Lots of interesting things. I don't want to keep you too long, but as one person said, very fluently, US policy in the Middle East is a mixture of ignorance and arrogance. I haven't seen that in this time. This is very different, and I wish US policy would have been rather in this kind rather than the perceptions that we have. Just want them to end by thanking my colleagues here for coming, jet-lagged, busy with all the meetings, but giving us their thoughts, and thanking the audience for their active participation and staying so patient for almost 2 hours. Thank you very much.